So a question that I've gotten quite a few times over the year is how to build a team comp, how to draft, how to ban, and all that kind of stuff. I find that very hard to summarize in a single video, but I can at least touch on aspects of that. And with the first SMITE Pro League games for Worlds going on at the moment, or having finished now the qualifier rounds, we have quite a few different interesting games where we can look at team comps. So today we're going to talk a little bit about unusual team comps, more specifically team comps that utilize an unusual number of different types of damage. So normally you're gonna have a team with 3 physical damage dealers and 2 magical damage dealers. This is a standard team basically. You have a physical hunter, a physical assassin in the jungle, and a physical warrior in solo lane. Along with that you have a magical mage mid laner, and you have a magical guardian in the duo lane, or in support at least. And of course you can drift away from this standard setup depending on how you want to play. There are team comps that utilize 3 magical characters instead, which is not that unusual just yet, just a little bit. And then there are also team comps that utilize 4 physical characters or 4 magical characters. And from newer players you often get the question, isn't it inherently bad to have a team with 4 of the same type of damage because that's easier to counter build, and to some degree that is true, but there are still reasons to go into those comps under specific circumstances or if you want to achieve a specific goal. And that's what we're going to talk about today on the example of 3 SPL games from the recent qualifiers for Worlds, which I think were very interesting. Now, first game here is going to be extremely interesting in regards to team composition already. This is the second match of SK Gaming versus Sanguine, and in this match, both teams had 4 physical characters and just 1 magical character. On SK Gaming, those characters were Tyr, Thor, Hel, Hercules, and Apollo. Before we look at the other team, let's talk about this comp a little bit. So what we can see here is we only have Hel as a magical character, and that is especially interesting because Hel isn't even necessarily a high damaging character. While she can dish out reasonable amounts of damage, she doesn't have a big ultimate that could turn around a team fight because she doesn't have an ult in that sense, and she also isn't necessarily safe enough by herself to just go into the middle of a fight. Of course, Hel is a character that has survivability through her heals and increased mobility and cleanses and everything, no doubt about that. But still, if the enemy team decided that magical damage is the main issue, then they would of course try to focus her out. Now, Hel is an extremely valuable character in late game anyways, so SK is basically betting it all on black here. The entire team has to work together to defend Hel so that they have their sustain and that they have their magical damage. In order to do that, they have a lot of disruptive characters though. They have Tyr and Hercules who can easily push enemies away from Hel, they have Thor that can wall enemies off, and they have Apollo, still an ADC with an AoE CC, which most of them don't have, at least not one that they can reliably use like that. But that's not the only angle to this strategy. Along with that, they have 3 very strong characters for the early game. They have Hercules, who, well, is just an early game beast in any regard and is mostly known as the invade character at the moment. They have Tyr, who has always had high bully potential early. He's got 2 abilities from level 1 onwards. So this guy is definitely someone who pressures in early stages, especially since his buffs. And they have Thor, who since his buffs is most definitely an early game character too. An all-rounder still, but he has that super high burst that, especially in early mid game, is most noticeable. And then for late game, the team is still set up okay-ish due to the fact that they have that Hel and they have an Apollo who will also come online a little bit later. So it's not a team that completely entirely relies on early game. Overall, I would say that they still sacrificed a little bit of late game here and took a risk by not having another Guardian who would have a big late game ultimate, for example. But that was their intent and their goal, and they rolled with it. And it kind of was something that worked a little bit better because the team on the other side of the match didn't really look all that different in that regard. The team comp here was Achilles in solo, Erlang Shen in the jungle, Kukulkan in middle, Horus in support, and Ullr in ADC. Yes, you heard that right, 3 warriors. And that's kind of the reverse of what we used to see back in the day, where we had these team comps with 3 guardians and 2 hunters. This comp has a few interesting perks of a different kind though. On one hand, you have Achilles, who has an execute. The execute doesn't rely on any type of damage, just for the enemy to be below the threshold. So that is something worth keeping in mind. Executes are very useful in these type of comps because they kind of offset that one-sided damage a little bit. Additionally, Horus has a built-in protection shred that is relatively easy to apply with his 2, and that is 30 flat protection for everyone at max rank. So that adds a lot of damage, especially from physicals, but also from magicals in this case as well. And then you have to keep in mind that Kukulkan is just an absolute damage beast at the moment, as long as you can keep him alive. And I guess that was the purpose here. Kind of functioning in a way, let's put it that way, similar to a hunter. Of course he's not a hunter, and of course he doesn't quite have the same DPS in late game, but he can easily compete with hunters in late game damage output across a team regardless, just because right now it's very easy to apply his abilities and the damage coming from his abilities is very strong. Still, much like SK's team comp, the comp here is very much focused on single target CC. The only real big CC that we have here is Erlang Shen's ultimate. So this team isn't geared ideally for late game either. And while I would say the comp in general here is more reliable than SK's team, because you have Kukulkan for the reliable magical damage and you will definitely get enough physical damage off, you have a comp against that just works very well against this comp. They are relatively even in early game damage. One team has Uller, the other team just has a little bit more of early game warriors in their favor. And the disruption from both teams kinda interrupts each other's purpose. So for example, an Erlang Shen's job would be to turtle to the hell and take her down as fast as possible in a team fight. That would be the main goal. But the problem is that Erlang Shen really relies on sticking to the enemy. And he cannot do that if he gets pushed off by Tyr or by Hercules, or gets messed by Apollo, or gets stunned by Thor immediately. And all of them can do that at a relatively far range. They don't have to be super close to hell in the first place. And we see similar patterns throughout the team, with Achilles having to dash close to enemies and Horus having dash close to enemies. They all just get disrupted very hard, especially by Tyr and Hercules, but also the rest of the team. And if you lock anyone but hell down, then they're most definitely going to get cleansed. As such, I would have given it to SK in late game here, even though I would say in a casual game, Sanguine's comp would be easier to execute. But it didn't even get there. SK invaded the jungle from the start of the game with a 5-man, got the first kill, and then Hercules got another kill with Blink over to the speed buff, and the game just snowballed from there. And because their team comp was so strong in early game, the game was over after 16 minutes. With the exception of Erlang Shen, who tried to build into a Void Shield in late game, none of the members of Sanguine actually tried to go into a physical defense-focused build. We saw that Achilles got his Gladiator Shield, but then also got a Blackthorn Hammer, and Horus did get a Gauntlet of Thebes, not a Sovereignty, and then was probably going into Ritual Dagger. So there wasn't really an attempt to block off damage that way. Whereas on the other side, SK Gaming went into a Breastplate on Hell very early on as third item, which of course deflects a lot of the damage that would be coming her way in the first place, making it even harder to counter that team. In that regard, it's probably very problematic to go 4 physicals against Hell as well when she's in that type of comp. And they also had Hercules going into a Mystical Male very early on. That means that he was going to be able to deal magical damage throughout the fight as well. And you can't really focus Hercules down off all targets, so that would have been even more of a problem for Sanguine in the long run. So I think through their optimization, they had another advantage here that never really showed because the game was over before it even happened. The next game we'll look at is the first game of Sanguine versus Simplicity. And in this case, I am not quite sure what the plan was. On Sanguine's side, we once again had a team with 4 physical characters, whereas Simplicity had a team with 3 magical characters. Sanguine's team was Thor solo, Susanoo jungle, Anhur mid, Erlang Shen support, and Thor's ADC. Now, if you haven't kept up with the Pro League in a while, the case of a mage being played in ADC is not that rare anymore. It is something that we see more often. That is a completely different topic for another day, but it's not something that's completely out of the ordinary at this point. I just want to point that out if you're not really familiar with the meta and the pro scene right now. The decision to put Thoth as ADC as the only mage, on the other hand, is interesting. On one hand, yes, it makes sense. This is the lane where you get the most farm, and if you only have one magical damage dealer, then you want to get them as much farm as possible. But on the other hand, it also makes them more vulnerable to any sort of ganks coming their way, and of course the other team would try to focus them as much as possible, so it's a risky decision at least. What's more interesting to me is the overall team comp here. Thor is an all-rounder that can definitely be played in a comp like this, no question about that. ZiSotto, on the other hand, surprises me. He is a very strong character at the moment, but he doesn't really fit that well in a team comp that depends on everyone doing multiple things, in my opinion. He was played in the jungle, so it was more up to the Thor to be more of a tank, but I still found it a bit of an odd choice. The Anhur in mid makes sense to some extent, because Anhur is a high pressure god, and especially against his lane opponent here, that is definitely valuable. And he comes with a passive that gives him 20 physical protection reduction against any targets that he hits. And that is applied for your allies as well, so that's very useful if you have a team with a lot of physicals. Erlang is a god that makes me wonder a little more again. I see his potential through the ultimate, but I still think he's a bit overvalued in these types of comps due to the fact that at the end of the day he has to be very close to have most of his impact. And that as a support, in my opinion, is more useful if you have a solo laner that can supplement that better than Thor can. And then, of course, Thoth as the only magical damage dealer. Thoth has some perks in that regard because he has relatively short cooldowns, meaning he can spam his abilities quite often throughout a team fight, and he also can use them from relatively long range. So his overall damage output and safety should be pretty good, but still, I don't necessarily see him as an only mage that you should have on your team compared to maybe a mage ADC, because I think that output is just not as good as also the Kukulkan that was chosen in the other game. On Simplicity's side, we have Jormungandr in solo, Ratatoskr in jungle, Merlin in middle lane, Serket in support, and Kronos in ADC. The first interesting god here to look at is Merlin, because Merlin has a percentage protection shred in the fire stance of his 2, which of course can be utilized by his teammates. Additionally, with Kronos you have a character that can apply demonic grip, which greatly helps magic focused comps. Jormungandr also has an incredibly easy time applying Stone of Binding to enemies through his pools, meaning that there's going to be consistent protection reduction on however he targets out, and that of course further facilitates the damage output from anyone here. Ratatoskr also comes with protection reduction in his 2, but that is only physical, so only Serket benefits here. Serket, on the other hand, is also a useful pick into any mixed comp, but typically more useful for a full physical comp, as she also has physical protection reduction through Deathbane, and she also has true damage, so it doesn't really matter who builds any protections against her. But of course, between the physical protection reduction from both Ratatoskr and Serket, the enemy team has to gear themselves towards a reasonable amount of physical protection along with the magic protection that they will have to counter if they want to significantly reduce their damage output as well. Simplicity's team here lacks your traditional late game setup to a larger degree, because it's much more about disruption throughout a team fight. You have a little bit of lockdown with Serket, you have Jormungandr who will constantly be a nuisance, you have Ratatoskr who can drop in at any point, and Merlin who can relatively freely put down his abilities to disrupt any place of the fight, and then you have the consistent DPS from Kronos. I would call this a very chaotic team comp, but the chaos is something that both teams have to manage. On one hand, Simplicity had to make the right calls at the right times in their team, but Sanguine also had to have the right reaction to those calls. This is of course true for every match, but more so for one where the enemy team comes at you from relatively unexpected angles. And even more so when your job is to protect a Thoth that will now be focused out by a Jormungandr and a Ratatoskr ult and probably a Serket lurking somewhere as well. The game actually started out relatively even and swung into Simplicity's favor over time. And I would attribute at least part of that to the itemization. Sanguine seemed to not really know what to do against that comp. They built very standard damage-focused builds without any specific counter direction that they seem to be going into, other than building some anti-heal, which isn't necessarily even the most important thing against a comp like this. Simplicity, on the other hand, went full throttle on the physical defense. Jormungandr had a Jade Emperor's Crown as his first full finished item, reducing the damage output of the enemy team from the start. Ratatoskr had a Void Shield, further reducing the enemy protections, really forcing them into heavy physical defense if they wanted to build physical defense at all. A Shifter's Shield along with that for more survivability, and therefore was also pretty much untouchable. Zakat didn't even specifically itemize into any protections targeted at anything, just went for the general style of Gauntlet of Thebes and Ritual Dagger, but it just wasn't necessary to go into more because she would not be focused out in the first place and everyone else was surviving quite well. Towards the end of the game, Jormungandr also had a Breastplate of Valor as well as a Stone of Binding and Mantle of Discord, so he was super unkillable, especially from physical damage. And along with that, even Kronos had built a Celestial Legion helm, so there wasn't much damage output that was coming through from Sanguine at all. Sanguine had hardly built any specific items to counter out the enemies, with the exception of Susanoo having gone into Ancile, but that alone wasn't enough. And because I love Sanguine so much, we're quickly gonna look at a third game that involved Sanguine versus Hype Unit. In this game, Sanguine actually played a 3 physical, 2 magical team comp that doesn't really need to be discussed further. It was Jormungandr, Hunbatz, Merlin, Fenrir, and Jingwei, but Hype Unit played a 4 physical comp. This comp was King Arthur, Camazotz, Set, Amaterasu, and Persephone. The gods that stood out here to me were, on one hand, Amaterasu, because she can apply a damaging bonus effect to targets and an aura around them as well, that increases damage taken by 10%, which I guess in a way is kind of like a different way of penetration anyways. Not to mention that she also has an aura that increases all power by 30. But what also stood out to me was the other choice here being Persephone. And Persephone as the only magical actually makes a lot of sense. Of course, she is a very high damaging character, much like Kukulkan, so that in my opinion also gives her a reasonable amount of usefulness as an only mage. But that's not the only point. If you look at Hype Unit's team comp as a whole, they were not set up as a team that would protect Persephone at all. Camazotz, King Arthur, and Set have very limited defensive capabilities, and even Amaterasu as a support is not necessarily the best one at protecting someone, especially not if we looked at the comp that SK had first with Tyr and Hercules. Persephone, however, doesn't rely on that because Persephone has her passive. If you focus Persephone down early in the fight, which you may very well do, you will probably lose a lot of health in the process already because she can place herself in a way where you're going to at least be punished to some degree for going in on her through her plans. And that's just the start, because when she's dead, she will still come back and she will still keep fighting and still deal magical damage anyways. And you still have to deal with the rest of this disruptive team comp at the same time. And this comp is very, very hard to stop. You have Camazotz who can attack from the sky and there's no getting away from that. You have Set who can teleport in wherever he wants to. You have King Arthur who is constantly spin dashing through fights at all times. And you have Amaterasu who also has her dash and her ultimate and increased mobility for teams in general if she sacrifices the power for it. That is a lot to keep track of and a lot for a Merlin to deal with if he gets jumped. On the other hand, Sanguine made the smart choice of picking Hunbatz here relatively late, which puts a lot of disruption into this team comp already, because they all can go in somewhere, but they all run the risk of immediately getting disrupted by Hunbatz then, or getting picked out by Fenrir, who was picked last as well, so it kind of evens out a little bit. And even is how this game played as well. By 20 minutes it was 10-10 and both teams were around 50,000 gold. However, just 9 minutes later, Sanguine was up by more than 10,000 gold and had taken the lead by 6 kills. And along with their performance, of course, I would put a reasonable amount of the impact here on their item choices. They went for a Jade Emperor's Crown on Jormungandr right at the start of the game, but they also got Gauntlet of Thebes as well as Sovereignty on their support on Fenrir, meaning they were loaded with physical defense and physical damage reduction whenever they were teamed up in a fight, and the later you get into the game, the more teamed up you are, the more of an impact that will have. While Hype Unit ended up building a Void Shield, which of course helps the team, I think they would have benefited greatly from also having at least one mystical male for further disruption in that regard. Especially King Arthur is a good guard for that. He survives in teamfights most of the time, gets around a lot, and would do a lot of additional damage. So at the end of the day, this game went in favor of Sanguine with their more traditional team comp. I was originally planning to discuss more unusual team comps in general in this video as well, but I absolutely didn't expect that discussing these team comps would take so much time already, so we'll do that another time. And if you enjoyed the video up to this point, feel free to click the sub button and maybe the bell. It really helps me out. And of course, you will also be updated for that future video where we could discuss more things about unusual team comps, especially when it comes to what guards are good to pick into that. There are also going to be tons of codes around the description and stuff, so check that out if you haven't yet. And other than that, see you for the next one tomorrow. DukeSloth, out.